So I'll save some of that for your personal viewing pleasure. Hi all, welcome to week 4. It's Tudor week! Yay! I'm excited, if you can't tell, and that is because the Tudor era is my focus area for period styles, and that means I just went out and did a little bit of extra work because I'm particularly interested in this period. And full disclosure, there's a couple of reasons why that is. The first is that I really think like Elizabeth I is a super interesting figure in history, and I think she's kind of a badass, honestly. But the second, maybe the most important, is that I really like Shakespeare. If anybody's watching this, they know that I really like Shakespeare, for a variety of reasons. Shakespeare was one of the first reasons that I kind of got into theater in the first place. They were some of the first plays that I ever read, and some of my best memories, especially from like high school and stuff like that, are based around Shakespeare. I was really excited to get to this week, especially because we got to go on a trip to Stratford-Upon-Avon, which is Shakespeare's birthplace, and basically the entire town is a museum to Shakespeare, give or take. I had the time of my life. So I've got a variety of things to show you today, and the first is actually going to be me talking at you a little bit more about an art encounter that I did and that didn't go quite as planned. It was supposed to be with the first folio copy that they have at the British Library, but they don't have a first folio on display right now, so I ended up spending some time taking a look at the rest of their Shakespeare display and just critically analyzing why it is set up in the way that it is. So we're going to start with that, then move on to Stratford-Upon-Avon, and then a bonus adventure around a ruined castle that has some strong Tudor ties. One of the challenging things about the British Library is that you can't actually take any pictures inside the museum portion because the objects there are so delicate. So you're just going to have to listen to me describe what I saw to you while I was in there for 3 straight days. Let me tell you, that was a long commute, but I'm glad I made it. Day 1. The folio isn't fucking there! I found some of the sonnets, and I found a really good copy of Adonis and Venus, and he's the only author in the place who has his own case, so I suppose I'll look at that instead. Day 2. This case is actually pretty cool. It's right at the entrance/exit to the kind of viewable collections part of the British Library, and it's almost like a little shrine to the man. Right next to it is this plaque in thanks to those who collected the works that are present in the first folio, because, you know, without them we would be missing like half of his plays, and I thought that that was kind of sweet. This case is definitely good if you're a sonnet lover. It's got one side that is all the history of the sonnets and the other side that's a little mix of everything. It starts with works that inspired Shakespeare and ends with works that were inspired by him, with a couple of little interesting bits in the middle, including one of the first publications of all of his poems, inaccurately. They cut some, they edited some, and I was like, how dare you! Huh. And I also found this really dense, kind of scary looking letter from a guy named William Reynolds, who was in the British Army back in Shakespeare's day and was very, very convinced that Adonis and Venus was written about him and Queen Elizabeth. He was a little bit nutters. Along the lines of Adonis and Venus, I didn't realize that that was his most popular work in his lifetime. Like, plays can get fucked. It was all about his long form poems, and I think that some of that has to do with its sexually explicit nature. One of the most famous lines from the poem is from Venus to Adonis, and it is, "I shall be a park and you shall be my dear." I'm like, Lord, okay. Keep it together, 16th century hooligans, good heavens. Day 3. Of the 8 items in Shakespeare's display, the one that I keep coming back to is William Reynolds' letter. It's really indicative that like Shakespeare totally mattered in his day, though not for the reasons necessarily that he matters so much now. I think it's very interesting that his kind of display is right at the beginning and the end of this room. It's kind of like the place begins and ends with Shakespeare. He's nestled in right between arts and sciences, literature and music, which I think is a really appropriate location for a playwright. And I couldn't help but wonder looking at it and how much speculation there is, and especially with the plaque dedicated to those who collected his works, how hard it is to imagine how much of his stuff he actually did. And I think we just kind of have to take it on faith that he was as extraordinary as we want to believe he was, and I'm okay with that. If people want to hear my rant about how Shakespeare's like Santa Claus, they can go look at my personal vlog from week 4. I'm still sad that I didn't get to see the folio, but fortunately a little bit later when we went to Stratford-Upon-Avon, I did. Stratford-Upon-Avon is very much a Tudor town now, and I realized that actual Tudor houses are not pretty and posh. They look like they were drawn by drunk people. The Tudor era is hallmarked by Queen Elizabeth I, who some believe is basically the greatest person to have ever lived. We started by going to Mary Arden's farm. She was Shakespeare's mom, and she had an absolutely gorgeous house, and I learned a great deal about Tudor architecture. Everything there was really short, not because the people were tiny, but because they just didn't have the money to build full-length doors. I got to stand on a floor that actual Shakespeare stood on, and that made me really, really excited. I then went to the church where Shakespeare is buried and where he practiced, and I had a really, really weepy encounter. I'll probably post a bonus video in which I read what I wrote about that later after I'm done humiliating myself about it. We also made quick stops at Anne Hathaway's house, Shakespeare's wife, and his birthplace, which is in the city center of Stratford-Upon-Avon, and they have just the most delicious little museum there talking about the folio, about outfits of the time. I really thought that the silhouettes, especially of the female clothing, were really interesting. It was all about that hips and bust baby, and a really lovely memorial to his work. The new place is a house that Shakespeare had built for himself, but it was only a couple years before he died, and the dude after him burned it down because he was sick of tourists. So there's just a really, really lovely memorial there to Shakespeare's work, and I had fun looking at that. I also spent a little bit of time at his daughter's house and her husband. He was a medic, and so I spent most of the time there learning about the humors and looking at his scary saws. Can you believe living in a time without anesthetic? Like, holy cow. There are also gorgeous statues for Shakespeare around, and my favorite one was this that you're seeing right now with the lovely quote, "I am not only witty in myself, but the cause that wit is in other men." I loved that. I want to be that someday. I was also quite taken by Lady Macbeth here, whose hands are dripping water from the rain, but it reminded me of the blood, and this lovely statue of Shakespeare whose hand I got to hold. Like I said, I'm a total Shakespeare sap, and going to Stratford was basically the best trip of my life. So, as you may have noticed, Stratford was great. I had an amazing time, and it was right at my birthday, too, and I can't think of a better present than getting to stand there and weep over the tomb of a man I didn't know. If you want to see the second half of my activities for this week, check out my walking tour of Stratford-Upon-Avon, which is in the description box down below. I did a little walking map of all the sights to see and the order in which you should see them, plus a couple of pub and snack stops along the way. On our way back from Stratford, we got to stop at Kenilworth Castle, which I just about shat myself over. It is this amazing ruin, and ladies and gentlemen, I talk about this in my personal vlog, but it looks like a Legend of Zelda castle, which I was very excited about. We got to go on my birthday, so sit back and let me tell you a little bit about this very interesting little ruin and the history surrounding it. Kenilworth Castle was built just before the Tudor era and owned primarily by a man by the name of Dudley, who is by many known to be the Queen's favorite consort. Actually, in the National Portrait Gallery, 2 of their images are stuck right next to each other, which I think is absolutely darling. This castle was so big and so awesome that a bunch of enemy forces kept trying to take it over after Dudley had died, and the British government actually blew it up themselves so people would stop squatting in it. So now it's this ruin. It's absolutely gorgeous, and many parts of it are still in really great upkeep, like the garden you're seeing here. Very, very much in that fancy pants English garden style where it's all lines and beauty and very presentational, much like their theater. I had a great time roaming around and exploring and looking at the graffiti on the walls, some of which is from the 1800s and earlier. It's really kind of a time capsule of travelers. And I was really, really fascinated by that. I was a happy lady. We went here on my birthday, and it was really just kind of the greatest time ever. Good job, everybody. You made it through the Tudor era with me. I had the most fun, I think, finding all of this stuff, but I'm actually really excited too about my next video, which piqued my interest in something that I really hadn't thought about before, British politics. This is the time to be thinking about it, so tune in soon for my video on the era of Reformation and Restoration, in which there were kings, then there weren't, then there were kings again. And until then, thank you so much for listening. Live your best lives and be good.